This week we're going to talk about the former prophets, and I'll explain a little more what that means. And the title of this week's lecture is Kingship or Kinship. In other words, we'll look at the dynamic in the Old Testament whereby kingship undermines the idea of family or kinship. So in the Exodus, God calls Israel to be a people of God, a people set apart, or as Brueggemann mentions, he might call this an alternative community. So far, Genesis and Exodus have documented that particular calling, and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy explain how Israel is supposed to be a people set apart. So eventually the Israelites return to the land of Canaan after the Exodus. It takes a long time, over 40 years. And the former prophets tell the story about what happens next. So it's a very, very long story. And it's covered in, I guess we would say, 6 books in the Old Testament: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, Samuel and Kings are divided into 2 parts only because the books are so long they would not have fit on one continuous scroll. Ultimately, if a scroll gets too large, it becomes unwieldy. So whether you call this 4 books or 6 books, I guess is up to you. These books are called former because they come first in the book order. So sometimes these are called the former prophets as opposed to the latter prophets, which are everything else that follows them in the Old Testament. And essentially these books tell the story about how Israel came to have a king and the experience of Israel with kingship. So eventually the Israelites asked for a king of their own, which the Old Testament argues is their fatal downfall, because in asking for a king, they are, number one, asking to be just like all the other nations around them, which is opposed to the idea of being a different kind of community. And second, they are rejecting the rule of God over them. So they are choosing or demanding even inherited versus prophetic leadership. So if you look at the prophets like Moses and Samuel and any of the other later prophets, these prophets don't pass on their prophetic charism to their children. They are chosen by God, and the idea is that you do not have inherited leadership, or in other words, that the main prophetic leader of the community didn't get that job because they were in a particular family. They get the job because they were chosen by God. This set of former prophets was probably completed in 2 different editions. So the first edition probably ended around 2 Kings 23 with the reign of a particular king called Josiah, who was a very idealized king because he actually reads and follows the law. The first edition was probably much more a glorification of Israel's kings, so more like what you would read in the surrounding cultures. The surrounding cultures spent a great deal of time documenting how great their kings were. But then after Israel was invaded by Babylon, somebody took the original edition and finished the story. And most people think they went back through and documented how and where Israel went wrong. And again, the core of the argument is that Israel chose kingship as opposed to the prophetic leadership that God had set out for them. So this is kind of interesting because a great deal of this, and of course the other prophets, are very critical of Israel. And it's interesting to think about how and why a culture would preserve literature, especially when it's so difficult to do so, that's critical of themselves. That is very interesting. They lay out all of the criticisms against their own people, against their own system. So I think it's helpful to understand how a lot of these texts revolve around what is called the law of the king. And the law of the king is set out in Deuteronomy 17. So in Deuteronomy, Moses is the speaker. And he says, I know that down the road you're going to want a king, even though that's not what God wants. I know this is going to happen. So he sets out a series of laws, the first law being no foreign kings will rule over you. The second being that kings of Israel may not acquire many horses, and certainly not Egyptian horses. And the reason for this is that horses were a symbol of military power. And if you go back and look at the story of the Exodus, particularly the story where the Israelites are crossing the Red Sea, look at the prominence of horses and chariots in that story. So this is really a rejection of having a military like Egypt's military. The third law is that the kings may not acquire many wives. Kings may also not accumulate great wealth. Kings must read from the law every day. And finally, kings should not exalt themselves over the rest of the people. So this is the law of the king as set out by Moses speaking in Deuteronomy 17. So what ultimately happens, as predicted, the Israelites demand a king. And in 1 Samuel 8 and 1 Samuel 10, we are told that this is an explicit rejection of Yahweh's rule over them, or Israel's God's rule. Samuel specifically warns the people that, in summary, kings will take whatever they want from your family. They will take your land, they will take your children, your sons and your daughters. You will have to work for them whenever they ask. They will tax you, they will take your crops. This is a bad deal. But the Israelites keep saying, give us a king so we can be just like everybody else. More pointedly, kings will treat their subjects as slaves, just like the Egyptians did. Even David, who is probably the most honored king, at least within Christianity, seems like a borderline case in this regard. He doesn't have tons of wives, uh, but he has 4 or 5 of them, and he doesn't tend to treat women very well. Maybe you could say he doesn't accumulate wealth. I'm not sure. There's nothing about him acquiring a great army. But when we get to Solomon, the story shifts very significantly. So Solomon most certainly violates each and every law except the first one, in that he is not a foreigner. But other than that, Solomon accumulates wealth, he gets lots of wives, he explicitly gets horses, and he goes to Egypt to get them. It's sort of like going down a checklist, and Solomon violates each and every one of these, and moreover, he worships foreign gods. So this is as predicted in Deuteronomy 17. So the former prophets really tell one long story. And we tend to pull out the stories that we like. So we like the stories of Joshua marching around the city, and we like the story of David's being chosen by Samuel, and David and Goliath. And we like the story of Solomon and then the Queen of Sheba, and how Solomon gets all of his wisdom. So we too, in some ways, become enamored with adventure and wealth and power. But the kings in the Bible, generally speaking, um, act in a remarkably consistent way. So, Abram's wife, I mentioned this a little bit last week, Sarai is taken by Pharaoh in Genesis 17. Joseph, acting as a pharaoh, takes all of the livestock, money, and land from the starving Egyptians in Genesis 47. Pharaoh in Exodus wishes to kill all the firstborn sons. So think about what that does to the social structure of the Israelites that we spent so much time on earlier in the course. If you get rid of all the sons, you immediately eliminate all the leadership, and the women are rendered helpless, essentially. Solomon hoards wealth, not recognizing where it came from. He enslaves his own people for his building projects. King Ahab, you maybe remember this story in 1 Kings 21. It's a story worth reading. Kills a man and steals his land when the man refuses to sell it to him because he says he can't sell it to him under the covenant with God. But King Ahab just takes him and kills him. Of course, David does the same thing in 2 Samuel 11. He wants this woman. He has the husband killed, and he takes what he wants. So it's a story that repeats over and over in the Bible. And even when the New Testament opens, we have Herod, who is once again killing little boys. So he's acting just like the Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. I think for the Israelites, um, their experience with kings is essentially bad. The kings are pointed to as the people that mislead the rest of the nation. And of course, the Israelite people aren't necessarily innocent in this particular process either. So, good kings in Israel are far and away the exception rather than the rule. And if you read through the former prophets, you'll realize this. And even the good kings, the ones that we think of as good, have their definite failings. So the Israelites counter this tragic story of the downfall of their nation, of their forgetting God, and ultimately of their being invaded by Babylon by trying to remember where they've come from. And this is really the role of the Old Testament as a whole and the former prophets in particular. And I think why they have so painstakingly recorded all of these texts that we have today. They know internally that their tendency is to slip back into the slavery of Egypt that they are liberated from by God in Exodus. And they even impose this slavery upon themselves. Yet the prophets are seen as those who remind them where they come from and remind them to keep on returning back to God.